This is the Ross Kaminsky Show. Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
One of my very favorite guests, partly because he's not just a friend, but also a mentor, is Tom Krannawitter, professor of political science in a past iteration of his life, and now doing a little more private sector-y kind of stuff. President of Speakeasy Ideas. Everyone should check out speakeasyideas.com. Actually, Tom, give us 15 seconds on what you're doing there.
Packaging up the ideas that are the source of human freedom and flourishing and making them available for people in useful ways.
So everyone check out speakeasyideas.com. And I do want to say, especially in my more recent adult life, when I've already spent many years thinking about principles of freedom and the Constitution and politics and history and all these things, there are very few people that I think know enough and understand enough that I've considered them to be a mentor. Tom is one of the only ones. So I love having him on the show. And I wanted to start with you as, and this is now in your role as an expert on the Constitution, and not just what it says, but why it says what it says, right? Why do we not have a national popular vote for president in the United States? And why is this push to have a Colorado just follow the national popular vote such a terrible idea?
So the short answer, the most succinct answer is those who designed the Constitution thought in the selection of the president, and keep in mind the president, right, and the vice president, they're the only two elected national representatives, right? Everybody else, members of the House, represent a congressional district. Each senator represents the state, right, that sends them to the Senate. The president is the only person who represents the entire country, and it also has some unique powers as commander in chief. So the designers of the Constitution said they recognize the fact that a numerical majority, simply 50% plus one of any group of people, has zero moral authority. Zero, right? Just because it's a majority doesn't mean that that majority is good or just or right, that its intentions are right. And they were concerned with not merely the number of the majority, but the quality or the character. They wanted a reasonable majority, or if we can't get a reasonable majority, a moderate majority in the selection of the president, thinking that a moderate majority is more likely to select a more moderate kind of president, right? A wiser, juster person. And they asked the question, how do you get a moderate majority? Well, what if we require in the process of selecting a president that candidates appeal to many different interests spread out over a large geographic area, many different people over a large geographic area, and conveniently, the United States was already divided into states, so they said, let's do this. Let's give each state a certain number of electors, and therefore, right today, for example, someone can win California, New York, Texas, right, the three largest states, and you're still not even close to becoming president of the United States. You have to go appeal to some smaller states. The designers of the Constitution said that's a useful thing, that's a good thing, because it will make that majority more moderate in the selection of the president. As opposed to, there's an old term for a kind of national popular vote. It's called a plebiscite. A plebiscite is simply what the majority want at any time. And the founders argued that, rejected that in favor of the Electoral College. Now, what happens when here's another, challenge in discussing this whole idea of a national popular vote. That's actually the name of this organized effort, right, to replace the Electoral College, the national popular vote. And the truth is, there is no national popular vote. It doesn't exist. What we have today are 50 state-based elections, plus the District of Columbia now, Washington, D.C. can vote. And that means every state has its own internal voting mechanisms, right? Its own rules, its own laws. And there is no one national popular vote.
Let me just pause you for a second here. Okay. So the supporters of this national popular vote movement say, what you just described is what we have now, but it's some kind of relic and it had some kind of tie to discussions about slavery, and it's time to get over all of that and just have a direct vote for president of the United States and let, one man, one vote actually rule the day.
Right. And it had nothing to do with slavery. What it had to do, look, the entire United States Constitution, all of it, top to bottom, is undemocratic. It is the opposite of simple numerical majority mob rule. If we wanted direct democracy, right, then not only do we need to get rid of the Electoral College, we need to get rid of the entire judiciary, the judicial branch of government, because they're not elected at all by citizens. Why is it that we have this independent judicial branch that can actually strike down laws that are voted by popularly elected members of Congress? Because the idea behind the Constitution is that the will of the majority is not necessarily good or right or just. The purpose of government is not to do what the majority wants it to do. The purpose of government is to protect the individual natural freedom, the natural rights of every individual citizen. And that sometimes, in fact, often, that will not be what the majority wants to do. And so they tried to design a structure of government that would at least apply the brakes to an unjust majority and try to protect the rights of individuals against tyrannical majority factions. If you read, for example, through the Federalist Papers, we're actually doing a really fascinating kind of experiment right now. We have a little group, a club called Vino and Veritas, and we get together once a month and we're reading the Federalist Papers in the course of 2019. And the entire theme of the Federalists is how to protect the rights of individuals from unjust, tyrannical majorities. Because with any kind of democratic or Republican self-government, right, where the authority comes from the people, the great problem is an unjust majority. How do you protect individuals against that? And that's why there are multiple designs within the framework of the Constitution to achieve that goal, including the Electoral College. This idea of a national popular vote simply skips right over that and says, well, we just should do whatever the majority wants. The person selected president shouldn't be the best. It shouldn't be the selection of the most moderate group of people. It should be the selection of the most numerous group of people.
Right. And in fact, I'll play devil's advocate for a second, and I think your response will probably be something of a repetition of something you already said. But if you want to argue that 50% plus one of the vote does not necessarily mean that you get, the best president, and best can mean a lot of things here, right?
Right.
Then you surely can't argue that 50% minus one means you get the best president.
Well, and that's true, and that, as has been the case. I mean, think of an instance of a president I know quite a bit about. I've written books about Abraham Lincoln, was voted with only 39% of the vote. Now, that's a sort of interesting, unique instance, because in 10 states that became part of the Confederacy, they wouldn't allow Lincoln's name to appear on the ballot. So that 39% is a little misleading. But here's the other point I make. The proponents of national popular vote, they look at, there have been 5 instances in American history where the person elected as president did not win the most popular votes. And the most recent, of course, was 2016. Hillary Clinton had more popular votes than Donald Trump. And proponents of NPV say, well, that's a terrible injustice. That should never happen again. And I want our listeners to understand that every popular vote count in every election from 2016 stretching all the way back to 1788, the very first presidential election. In every one of them, the popular vote count means precisely nothing. And the reason it means nothing is no candidate in any one of those elections, no candidate was going after the most popular votes in the nation, because that's not the rules of the game. That's not how you win. Imagine, we just had a Super Bowl here not long ago, right? And the New England Patriots won. Imagine if someone came back and said, well, who did they play? The Rams, right? Yeah. If someone came along and said, the Rams actually had more completed passing yards in that game. Therefore, they should win. Everyone say, no, wait. The rule of the game is not that you win not by completed passing yards, you win by points. And so both teams, the coaches, the quarterbacks, everyone were focused on scoring touchdowns and kicking field goals, right? Scoring points. It's the same thing when we look back at historical presidential elections and look at the popular vote. Nobody in the game at that time was going after the popular vote. So, for example, Republicans for decades, right? They don't go out and campaign in California. Why would they? They know they're not going to get. If you had a national popular vote in the past, Republicans would go to California.
Right, and New York and all those places in Illinois.
Millions of Republican votes to be gathered out there.
And Trump has actually made that point. I mean, Trump, often toots his own horn, but he said, look, yeah, give me this is a year or two ago. He said, yeah, I'm fine with a national popular vote. He said, that would make it easier. I would just go campaign in California. I didn't this time.
Right.
And I would just change my strategy.
Right.
So
the important thing about that is when you look back at the vote totals from past elections, keep in mind nobody was trying to gather votes all across the country. So it's unfair. It's not accurate. It's highly misleading to look at popular vote totals from the past as some signal of how many people were actually voting for either candidate.
So just very quickly, I'll make my last comment on this, and I want to ask you about another subject. What frustrates me so much about this national popular vote thing is that it's essentially inconceivable that the margin of victory by a presidential candidate in the state of Colorado would determine the national popular vote winner. Even the closest national popular vote election that we had was 2000. And, if you took Colorado out, then the result would have been the same in terms of the national popular vote. Right. In other words, to me, it basically eliminates the need to have a presidential election in the state of Colorado because national popular vote. Okay, maybe the margin, if it's really tight, will be 500,000 votes.
Right.
And in Colorado, if it's really wide, will be 200,000 votes.
Right. It wouldn't change.
It wouldn't change the outcome. And this would apply to any small state, really. Right. I mean, and certainly in any small swing state, kind of close state. It's not even a point of having an election here anymore. And that's part of what frustrates me. All right, we just have about 4.5 minutes left.
Okay.
There was a bill that failed in the U.S. Senate 2 days ago that would have explicitly made it illegal to not provide medical care for a baby born alive as the result of a failed abortion.
Right. Okay?
And I have a very nuanced kind of question for you. And let me just tell my listeners before we go further with this that on abortion itself, I'm mostly pro-choice. I can live with some restrictions, but I think that if a baby is born alive as a result of an abortion that didn't abort the baby, then killing the baby or just letting the baby sit there and die, I think that's clearly murder.
Okay.
So my question for you is this a federal issue? A lot of people, pro-life people, really pissed off at the Democrats that it failed. And I think Democrats voted against it for the wrong reasons. But as someone who wants to support the Constitution and knowing that murder is almost never a federal crime and generally thinking we should not federalize our criminal code,
right?
What should I think about this?
Abortion was not a federal or a national subject under the original Constitution. It became, I think, in principle, I would argue, it became a federal issue through the passage of the 14th Amendment. So real quickly here, remember why the 14th Amendment was passed. This is on the heels right after the Civil War. And we've already passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But where is all the injustice happening? The race-based injustice, Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan and all that. It's at the state level. And so the 14th Amendment is passed in part to solve that problem of state-based injustice. It's why the 14th Amendment concludes, the very last passage of the first paragraph says, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So each state has an obligation under the 14th Amendment to offer equal protection of the laws to all persons, not just citizens. All persons.
But I see where you're going with this, and we've only got about 2 minutes left, although if you want to stick around, we could probably talk more about it a little later in the show. But if you go down that road, then why wouldn't you say, okay, then we should have a federal law against rape and a federal law against aggravated battery and just make our entire criminal code federal?
You don't need a federal law, right? Think what the 14th Amendment here is saying. It's not saying that we're going to have federal laws for everything. It's saying this 14th Amendment, we're telling the states, within your state legal code, you must offer equal protection of the laws. What is the purpose of government? The purpose of government is to protect the person and property and natural freedom of every human being, right? Within the scope of the law. That's the purpose of government. And so the 14th Amendment is saying to the states, what you may not do is you may not have, say, a law against murder and exclude black people from it. You can't do that, right? You got the law against murder or theft or rape or anything.
Right.
It has to offer equal protection to all persons. Black people, little people, very young people, all persons.
So this bill, and I've got a minute, this bill would have made it a crime at the federal level for a doctor to do such and such or not do such and such.
Bottom line, Congress has no constitutional authority to pass that.
Okay, so that was my question. So if you believe that the 14th Amendment, I got 30 seconds, if the 14th Amendment does what it does, but you're also saying Congress doesn't have the authority to pass it, then what's the answer for the pro-life crowd? You got 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I'm going to contradict myself because the 14th Amendment ends by saying the Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So if states are not offering equal protection of the law to all persons, including very young persons like unborn children, then Congress has the authority to correct that problem.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Dr. Tom Krannawitter, everybody check out speakeasyideas.com. Real quick, what's that book called?
Oh, this is our
10 seconds
to citizenship. It's available at speakeasyideas.com. Tells you what the rights and responsibilities of citizenship are and includes the text of the Declaration and the Constitution.
This report is sponsored by Account Temps.
Freezing fog this morning, some scattered slick conditions as you head out. We are busy.
I've kept Tom Krannawitter against his will, chained to the desk here for a few minutes, just to follow up on two quick things. First of all, so that I absolutely make sure I don't forget.
Yeah.
I had a couple of rather disappointed listeners send me a text saying, why didn't you ask Tom Sock Shoe? So Tom Krannawitter, professor of political science, leading expert on Abraham Lincoln and on the progressive era, sock, shoe, shoe, or sock, shoe, shoe?
Well, I'm a reasonable man, so of course it's sock, shoe, shoe.
I wonder, in your research on Abraham Lincoln, did you find any evidence of sock shoe for Abe Lincoln? I mean, he lived out in the woods. Maybe if he put on a sock, he wouldn't want to put it down on the wet ground on the outside of that shack in Kentucky or wherever it was he grew up.
You know, there's a somewhat unknown story where one night his wife, Mary, got really angry at him because Lincoln wouldn't pay attention to her. And she picked up a burning log from the fireplace and hit him in the head with it. And maybe it's because Lincoln was putting his shoes and socks on in the wrong order.
Or maybe getting hit in the head that hard really messed him up and addled his brain permanently. And from then on, he was sock shoe because reasonable people are sock, shoe, shoe.
Of course, yeah.
So maybe it caused some kind of trauma. Although I do think we should try to find some evidence, maybe a black and white video of Abe Lincoln putting on sock shoe.
I'm pretty sure sock, shoe, shoe is the fifth precept of the natural law.
Yeah, I guess so. We need to find out if Frederick Bastiat was sock shoe also. All right, so real quick, we got just a few minutes here. Maybe we can just finish up on this 14th Amendment thing. For those of you just joining us, in the previous segment of the show, I asked Tom whether it would be okay from the point of view of somebody who really respects the Constitution, for Congress to pass a law saying it would be illegal at a federal level for a doctor to not take care of a baby that was born alive following a failed attempt at abortion. And my gut instinct is that that's a state issue, generally murder, if you want to call that murder, and I actually do call that murder. If they kill a baby after it's born alive, or even just let it die, I call that murder. But generally, murder is not a federal crime, and I'm happy that most things are not federal crimes.
Right.
And you said there is a potentially valid constitutionally argument in fidelity with the Constitution to say that the federal government could, for example, either pass something like that or even define life.
Right. Well, and it comes through the 14th Amendment. What we have to keep in mind here is that the 14th Amendment really opened the door to federal supervision over state governments. It empowers Congress to pass measures to enforce the provisions of the 14th Amendment. And I'm going to summarize here in a nutshell a really long, complex story, but the bottom line is white people in the United States would not leave black people alone. The great race-based injustices were happening in local communities. Either local governments, state governments would pass laws that were injurious to black people, or they wouldn't enforce the laws. So, the Ku Klux...
So are we talking 1865? What are we talking about here?
Right out in that period after the Civil War, 1860s, 1870s.
Okay.
And so the 14th Amendment comes along and says, look, this is a constitutional amendment, and we are talking to you, state governments. You will offer equal protection of the laws to all persons, and if you don't, this amendment empowers Congress to pass legislation to solve whatever problems or injustices are happening at the state level. So if a state has, say, it has a law against murder, but it doesn't enforce that when black people are murdered, right? That would be an occasion for Congress to step in and pass legislation to solve that injustice. In the similar way, if a state has laws against murder, but they don't enforce it when physicians are murdering babies, that would be a justification for Congress to pass legislation similar to this bill that you're talking about just the other day.
And is there, like, if I put you in a debate class, sometimes in a college debate class, you were told by the person who's running the club, you must take a position that I know you totally disagree with, but just for the purpose of the exercise, you are going to make an argument in favor of something that I know you don't support. Is there any way at all to make an argument to say that a baby born alive as the result of a failed abortion somehow isn't due the same medical care as any other living person?
Wow.
Because I can't even think of one, and I like this kind of exercise.
Right. I mean, I can think of, well, there's a constitutional argument under the original design of the Constitution, what the founders and prior English theorists called the police powers. That is the power to regulate the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the people. The founders argued that should reside at the state level. And that's where you get the federalism. That's why most criminal codes, for example, are at the state level, right? Not at the national level. Maybe you make some kind of argument that really is the preserve of the states to make those kinds of distinctions. But you're always going to run up against this problem of the fundamental purpose of government is to protect, right, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the people within the scope of the law.
Yeah.
And that newly born child sitting there dying on the table is a person within the scope of the law, and the purpose of government is to protect its rights.
I think the most pro-choice person in the world can't argue that living, breathing baby isn't a person,
right?
And I think, regardless of the constitutional aspects and federalism aspects and all this, boy, I wouldn't want to be the Democrats on the side of that argument voting against a bill to protect a baby who was already born alive, and then claiming that that's somehow an infringement on abortion rights when it clearly isn't. Right. Tom Krannawitter, proprietor of SpeakeasyIdeas.com. Hey, again, Tom, 10 seconds. What is that book in front of you?
This is an introduction to citizenship, has a short little essay explaining the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and includes the text of the Declaration and the Constitution. It's available at SpeakeasyIdeas.com.
And written by you, other than the parts that were written by Jefferson and Madison?
That's right.
Everyone go to SpeakeasyIdeas.com. You might not even be able to tell the writing apart between Krannawitter, Jefferson, and Madison, because they are almost of one brain. Actually, Jefferson and Madison were kind of different. All right, Tom, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
We'll be right back and talk a little.